This is the most hyped beer in the US, and people are willing to wait 3 hours or more just to have a taste. I love beer as much as the next guy, but you'll never catch me in a line that long. You might have heard of this beer, the famed Pliny the Younger. Is it worth all that hype and the wait? That's up for debate. But what if you could skip the line and have some of your own Pliny on tap at home? That's what I'll attempt to find out today. Let's back up a bit and set some background to what Pliny the Younger is for the uninitiated. Younger is brewed by Russian River Brewing Company out of Santa Rosa, California. And Russian River is probably most famously known for commercially brewing one of the first double IPAs, known as Pliny the Elder. Head brewer Vinny Treluzzo went on to win dozens of awards, and that beer really helped put them on the map. And having been to Russian River, having Elder on tap, and also having several bottles before, I can tell you this is a must-try beer if you ever get the chance, and it's usually easier to find. Elder was first brewed in 1999, and in 2005, Vinny followed it up with Pliny the Younger, the first triple IPA commercially brewed. While Elder is about 8%, Younger has more malt, more hops, and comes in around 10.25%. It's bigger, bolder, and thanks to its clever release strategy, it's harder to find. Since they only brew it during a select and small window early in the year, that means a limited supply. Luckily I live in California, so Russian River distributes a few kegs of Younger around the state, and I've been lucky enough to get a pint. Which I feel like people don't realize, you can actually get tickets to these Younger Day events, and you don't have to wait in any lines. So keep an eye out for them if you live in Cali. But while it's certainly a fantastic beer, I still wouldn't wait in those lines for a taste. So let's try to brew one of our own, so we can have it on tap anytime we want some. Now before I get too ahead of myself, I do want to state that it'll be nearly impossible to clone Younger, as they keep the recipe pretty tight to their chest. And they also change out the hops just about every year. But Russian River has released the Elder recipe before, and there's also several blogs and recipes for Younger out there. So hopefully using all this we can get pretty close. I'll mainly be referencing Michael Tonsmeyer's recipe on his Mad Fermentationist blog. But there's also a great episode on Experimental Brewing Podcast about homebrewing an homage to Younger, and I'll be sure to include links to both in the description. With that in mind, here's the recipe I brewed up. 90% two-row, which for a triple IPA, this was about 17 pounds. And 10% corn sugar to help dry out the beer. This is one thing I did notice about the Pliny beers. They have a very dry finish, which helps the hops shine and make the beer quite crushable despite its higher ABV. Big thanks to the partners that made this brew day possible. Northern Brewer for providing all the ingredients, and Clawhammer Supply for providing the 120 volt electric brewing system. If you're in need of more ingredients or looking to go electric, I'll leave links to both these companies in the description. So I decided to follow Tonsmeyer's mash schedule, starting with a step mash at 143 Fahrenheit for 15 minutes to help break down the complex starches a bit more to make a more fermentable wort, meaning a drier finish. Alternatively, you could look to use some enzymes to help with this instead, which I've done before in my American Light Lager to great success. Be sure to check that one out if you haven't. After the 15 minutes, I raised up the temp to 148 Fahrenheit for 60 minutes for the main mash. Let's talk hops and bitterness. IPAs are bitter, and double IPAs are really bitter. So triple IPAs must be extremely bitter, right? Well, it's all kind of relative. Since we're adding more malt, the perceived bitterness won't be as intense as you would expect. So don't be too surprised when I tell you that the calculated IBUs for this beer are 150. I mean, technically if you look at Tonsmeyer's recipe, he says 199 IBUs. But it doesn't feel like that when you taste this beer. It certainly has a strong punch of hoppiness, but it's balanced out by all that malt that we're using. Any less hops and this beer might feel too sweet. So in order to get us started on the right foot, we're going to need a big punch of bitterness right at the top of the boil. In order to achieve that, I'm using 2 hop shots, which are basically CO2 extracted hop oils that are very concentrated. They work best for bittering, although you could use them for flavor and aroma additions, I suppose. But there is a trick to get the hop oils to mix with the wort. Otherwise they tend to float on top of the boil and eventually just stick to the sides of the kettle. First step is to place the hop shots in some warm water to get the oil loosened up. Next you want some high proof alcohol to help make the oil more soluble. I'm using Everclear. Yeah. And I just add a little bit to the glass and then shoot the hot chops into it. While the mash is going, I occasionally stir this up to help it dissolve and mix in a little better. And when the mash is done and the wort is to a boil, I started a 90-minute timer and added in this Everclear hop oil tincture. There are some charts online that help estimate how much bitterness you can expect from hop shots, but this should get us about 66 IBUs. Then with 1 hour left, I added in the next bittering hop, 2 ounces of CTZ, and that's pretty much it for the boil. Near the end of the boil, I added a Wolflock tablet for clarity and some Flameout to boost the nutrient content to help out the yeast. At the very end of the boil, I turned off the heat and then dropped in the corn sugar, giving it a stir to mix in, and then finally I added in all the flavor and aroma hops, which are 4 ounces of Amarillo, 3 ounces of Chinook, and 2 ounces of Simcoe. As I mentioned, Russian River changes out what kind of hops they use, so you can totally swap things in for your preference. I think this year they use some Elixir and Nectaron, so give it a try and let me know what you use. I chilled the beer down and then added in a nice big starter of US-05, but something like San Diego Super Yeast could work great here. Any solid, well-fermenting ale strain would be a good option. The wort had an original gravity of 1.090. With the yeast in, I let the beer ferment at 67 Fahrenheit. And a couple days into fermentation, I added in the first charge of dry hops. 1 ounce Amarillo, 1 ounce Chinook, and 1 ounce Simcoe. I put the hops into a bag and tossed it into the fermenter. Then, a little over a week later, the beer was done, and the final gravity came in at 1.010, meaning the final ABV on this was about 10.5%, just about on the money. And pretty dry too, which was pleasing to see. Before caking it up, I added in another load of dry hops, same as before, 1 ounce Amarillo, 1 ounce Chinook, and 1 ounce Simcoe. This time I opted for just tossing them loose into the keg. But if you do go this way, make sure you install a floating dip tube. Otherwise, you might get hops stuck in your regular dip tube. Ask me how I know. Anyways, I closed the keg, purged with CO2, then transferred the beer in, then carved it up until it was ready to drink. This beer is the definition of golden, with a nice steady head that really lingers for quite a while. It's still a bit hazy, despite all the findings that I threw at it, but this is probably due to the sheer amount of hops I added. The aroma is amazing. Loads of citrus, pine, and very resinous, much like you would expect from a great West Coast IPA. When I take a sip, the first thing that hits me is the strong bitterness, but not overly bitter. It's balanced against the malt sweetness, and as it sits on your palate, it definitely mellows out. There's a big punch of grapefruit, and it's very piney, almost sticky with all those hop oils. The hoppiness really coats your mouth, but it doesn't drink like you would expect for a 10+% beer. It really does go down quite easily. That is until you have a few and you remember just how strong 10% can be. I think if I were to brew it again, I would love to try some other hop varieties for the dry hops. Maybe even use some cryo to minimize the hop matter, which I know will be an issue when I get to those later pints in this keg. You could also try doing all the dry hops in the fermenter to help with that issue. But overall, I'm super pleased with this one. It's not a direct replica of Vinny's famed Pliny the Younger, but it is pretty damn close, and pretty damn good in my opinion. And I have no problems drinking or sharing this one. Plus, the only time I have to wait is the time it takes to fill up a glass. Better than any line, I'd say. Cheers and happy brewing, and thanks for watching. If you're looking for another great West Coast IPA recipe, I got an awesome one right here that's loaded with dank aroma and flavor. Check it out.